Well, it shifted
We
this
don't
way,
know
and
what
then I turned
difference
it
was
in.
made.
Neither do I.
It's been
It
tweaked
looks
to
the
her
exact same.
satisfaction.
It made a difference, okay?
Okay.
Let's see. Can I start differently now?
Did you press go?
I did. Yes.
Okay.
Well,
Today we actually wrap up the first life of Jesus. Next week we'll take care of his resurrected life.
is it the first life
The
of
first,
Jesus?
I know, the first life of Jesus. Really messed with your mind there for a moment. And then we have a break. Yep. Super Bowl Sunday is the 11th, and because many family traditions land on that day of the year, we shall not conflict directly with them. So that week will be off.
Well,
Are we
no, it's
having
an
something
unofficial.
at our
Like,
house or?
the Super Bowl Sunday is like a big.
No plans unless Manchester United is playing.
Yeah.
Let's see. I handed out a new reading sheet. Did everybody find the reading sheets?
Yes.
Okay. So that should be covering for the next 4 weeks. And then, can you hand me those blue sheets? Yeah. I don't think Roloff's got one of those. That is the winter course of study, which I think is still accurate.
Yeah, I think so.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, you are like right in the middle of my screen.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Do I gotta slouch?
Yeah.
And then you can see? Alright. Still in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. After Super Bowl Sunday, we'll shift into Acts. And then we will start rapidly going through epistles when we get to the second half of the book of Acts. Because they are short and they are all found at the end of the book of Acts. Without any further ado, let's look at Crucifixion week. Does anybody remember what the calendar date we left off last week with? Jesus arrives in Bethany.
Oh, that was a Saturday.
It was a Saturday.
March 28th, 33 AD.
Yes, March 28th, 33 AD, which means that first day, the week of Crucifixion week, is going to be Sunday, March 29th, 33 AD. So if you reference that illustration of the chapters of the Gospels, you have about 4 or 5 of them that apply to the first year of his ministry, another 4 or 5 that apply to the second year of his ministry, 4 or 5 to his third year, and then all of a sudden 5, 6, or 7 to Crucifixion week and the resurrection alone. So this is the heavy emphasis of the gospel accounts. And a quarter of what is recorded about Jesus is 6 days of Crucifixion week and his resurrection. So Sunday starts with the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, which is why we celebrate Palm Sunday, because they grabbed palm branches and laid them down on the path in front of Jesus while he was coming in. He borrowed a colt from somebody. It's kind of interesting because this is one of those places where the Gospels have a discrepancy. Matthew is trying to connect it to an Old Testament prophecy, and the Old Testament prophecy was clumsily translated into the Greek Septuagint so that it looks like the prophecy says that the Messiah enters Jerusalem on a donkey and a donkey's foal. And so Matthew has it recorded that Jesus came in on a donkey and her colt. How Jesus is riding 2 animals has been a lot of point of guessing for a long time. All the other gospel accounts have him riding a single animal, a colt. But this is one of those challenging to explain discrepancies in the Gospels, and there's no shortage of them. One of the things I should mention is that this actually lends to the authenticity and the accuracy of what we read. If you ever are a prosecutor and you are trying to build a case against somebody that they committed a crime, what you're looking for is getting the same story from multiple people that is too closely worked together. If they're exactly the same in every single one of their details, then you know that they talked through the story ahead of time and they're feeding you a bunch of lies. Because 3 or 4 people seeing the same events should have lots of discrepancies amongst the details.
The little details.
Little details, especially. Not the big story, but the little details. So we see some of these in Crucifixion week especially. Part of it we remember is Matthew was an eyewitness, he was there. John was also an eyewitness, he was there. Mark got his information from Peter, he wasn't there. Luke was also not there, he got his information from various sources.
Was Mark like Peter's, I'm spacing the term, but his protege?
Yeah, for a while. Traditionally, after Mark left Paul and Barnabas, he went and hung out with Peter for a while. So, and that's when the Gospel of Mark got written down. Anyway, so a little bit of discrepancies on the colt, but the crowds are yelling Hosanna or Hoshana. Does anybody know what that happens to mean?
No? I was gonna ask you that.
Mm-hmm.
Does it mean praise?
Nope, not quite.
Does it mean like glory to God?
Nope. They were saying Hosanna, glory to God in the highest.
That was the next guess.
That's the next thing, phrase, yeah. So Hosanna means Yahweh saves. It is slightly different verb conjugation than the name Joshua, which also means Yahweh saves, because the J-O is the Yah sound. And so in Hoshana, they dropped the J-O off of there. But you remember in the Old Testament survey last year how you have a Joash, but sometimes he's known as Jehoash.
Yeah.
And so the way that they put those together is kind of complicated. So Hoshana is one of them. But it's also a derivative of Jesus' name, because Jesus is Yeshua or Joshua, and it is almost saying his name, but not quite saying his name. Well, this provoked the Pharisees, of course, and so the Pharisees complained and say, Jesus, you should rebuke your disciples because they're saying things that are blasphemous or something to that effect. And Jesus says, if they don't cry out, the rocks will cry out.
Oh, yes. Oh, that would have been so cool.
It would have been really
I
cool.
wish they didn't cry out.
Yes. But that's the amazing thing, is the rocks actually do cry out. Because if you go to the Grand Canyon, you can see all the flood layers from the flood of Noah, and they cry out. This was a cataclysmic, watery catastrophe that happened in a short order of time, and it doesn't support the other theories of how those rock layers got laid down. Millions and billions of years. Alright, so shortly after that, in the Luke account, Jesus weeps over Jerusalem before he enters the city, and he foretells of the siege of Jerusalem, which happened several times since then, actually. It was laid siege to in 70 AD, and then again in 133 AD, and then a few times during the Crusades. The British laid siege to Jerusalem, and they actually got the upper hand, so they had airplanes, which the Ottoman Turks had not seen. They flew over the city of Jerusalem and dropped leaflets saying, "Get out of the city," signed Allenby. They couldn't read the English, and so they thought it was signed Allah. So Turks were like, we're getting out of Dodge because notes from the sky are telling us we have to go. It's from the word of Allah himself.
That is hilarious.
Yes.
Do you reckon they did that on purpose, or do you reckon that was just
I don't know, and that could be somewhat apocryphal. That's one of those things where it's like, I need to start tracking down these urban legends I've heard and find out how much veracity there are to them all. But it's like, hey, I can actually Google these things now.
You can.
I can. All right, so Jesus enters Jerusalem. He cleanses the temple by driving out all the money changers, and while he's there, he heals the blind and lame in the temple. The number of each is not specified. So this is interesting because if you remember in the book of John, in chapter 2, at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, he's also in the temple and he's also driving out money changers.
Evidently, it was not a permanent.
Take them back long to come back.
Nope. And so that one is dated actually, and is very clearly not the year of Jesus getting crucified. And it actually is quite clear that that is happening at the very beginning of his ministry. And this one is clearly triumphal entry day. And so Jesus did this at least twice. And then he returned to Bethany for the night, Bethany being a village on the Mount of Olives.
How far away was
particularly far, 2 miles.
How big was the Mount of Olives? Because like they always
Yes.
portray it as like this tiny little garden, but Bethany was a town in the Mount of Olives. Around the Mount of Olives, like is it
Yep,
just,
so
like,
the Garden of Gethsemane is a garden on the Mount of Olives, and Bethany is a village on the Mount of Olives, and there's Bethphage, which is also on the Mount of Olives. So this isn't a massive mountain, but if you can imagine a pretty good size hill that's got a few small villages and somebody's garden.
And
Still
so
works.
many olive trees.
Yep. If you want, you could probably use Google Maps and go zero in on all these locations and find out.
I suppose because they would have those.
They would have them there, yep. All right, moving on to Monday, March 30th. And of course, Jesus didn't know this is March 30th, but we do today, so I'm using them.
They're pretty dead though.
He's walking to Jerusalem, and while he's on his way, he sees a fig tree that doesn't have any fruit on it. And it wasn't the ripe fruit he was looking for. Fig trees produce something that is edible 4 months before it would have ripe fruit. And he was looking for those doodads that were edible, and it didn't have any fruit on it at all, so there weren't any of the doodads on it either. And so he curses the fig tree. And then in one of the Gospels, it's after that episode that he clears the money changers out of the temple. And this is either the third time he does it, which means that the money changers from the night before re-entered the temple, which is not outside of the realm of possibility. Or it is also possible that we have another discrepancy in the Gospel accounts and that they got a couple events rearranged.
Which one is that? Is that Luke or Mark?
I don't remember which one is which. The fig tree also has an interesting discrepancy in that 2 of them have the fig tree getting cursed one day and it's withered the next day, whereas one of them
Yeah.
has it cursed and it withers immediately.
Matthew's the one where there's a.
Yep.
Is the immediately like? Is it possible that when he's saying immediately, he's clarifying that it's not just the tree lies dormant or whatever, where it's like the tree just doesn't produce fruit but it's so green. He's saying immediately in the sense that the thing dies within short order.
Mm-hmm. The fun thing about Matthew's account is that he doesn't have anything happening after that, and whereas the other accounts do, that Matthew doesn't or cuts out. And so the Matthew account works to jump from Monday morning to Tuesday morning in short order without any difficulty. So, a few different ways it can be reconciled. Anyway, after Jesus clears out the money changers, he teaches in the temple, but it's not clear what he teaches. None of that is actually recorded from Monday. And then he leaves Jerusalem. So Monday is actually a relatively long day, which stands in great contrast to Tuesday. Tuesday of Crucifixion week is the day that everything happens. So Tuesday morning is for sure the morning that they find the fig tree withered. Matthew actually has the whole thing just getting cursed and withering instantly on Tuesday morning, but he doesn't have anything happening on Monday, so he may have just smushed it all together. Jesus gets into the temple, and the chief priests and the elders question his authority to teach and heal. And so Jesus says that he will answer their question as to by what authority he does this, if they will answer whose authority John the Baptist taught under. And so they have a huddle because that was a loaded question. And they decided amongst themselves that if they answered John the Baptist was preaching off a man's authority, then they'd all get stoned by the crowd because the crowd considered John the Baptist to be a prophet. That's not a good end to the day for them. And then they're like, can't say that he had his authority from heaven because then Jesus will ask us, why didn't you listen to him? And so they land on option C, we're not sure whose authority he had.
So he.
That was the diplomatic, we don't get stoned, but we don't give Jesus anything to work with. And so Jesus says, neither shall I answer by what authority I teach and preach. So he gets a get out of jail free card there. Then he jumps into 3 parables. Parable of the 2 sons, one who obeys and one who doesn't. And then parable of the tenants. And those are the nasty tenants who kill the servants and then they kill the son, and it's an illustration of the prophets and Jesus. And then he tells the parable of the wedding feast. That's another one of those parables that has a fun pivot in the middle of the wedding feast. Because first he invites everybody, but nobody comes. So then he invites people from the highways and the byways, and they all come. But then somebody got in without wedding clothes, and he gets thrown out. Yes.
What are the implications of that?
See, that's a sermon in and of itself, which makes the New Testament survey, and the Gospels in particular, so challenging, because every 3 verses could be a sermon. But
Is that the many will come and say, did we not cast out demons in your name?
I don't think so. Yeah, not going to speculate on that one. All right, so then Jesus gets questioned by 3 different groups of people. 3 tests here. The first one is the Pharisees. They come and ask him if they should pay taxes to Caesar. And this is fun because Jesus responds with what I think is a really good illustration of a word of wisdom. This is one of the supernatural gifts of the Holy Spirit in 1 Corinthians 12, and it is one that a lot of people don't agree on what a word of wisdom is. But I think that this is a good illustration of it because they're asking Jesus a yes or no question. Should we pay taxes to Caesar? Should we not pay taxes to Caesar? If he says yes, then the whole crowd says, oh, we hate you because we hate paying taxes. If he says no, well, then they can arrest him and throw him in jail and get the Romans to kill him because he's saying stop paying taxes to Caesar.
Yes.
Try that sometime with the IRS and see how it goes for you.
Free speech.
Right, they'll just say, you can say whatever you want, but if you don't pay taxes,
We'll
then
find
we'll
you.
find you. Yep.
Then get out.
Anyway, so Jesus answers and says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's, and everybody's mouths just hit the floor because they have no idea that that could come forth as an answer. No one can really say anything.
He created his own box. It was
Yep.
true, false. Creates his own box.
Creates his own box.
Yeah.
So then the Sadducees come forward because they saw the Pharisees got bested. And the Sadducees are an interesting group because nothing that they wrote or generated about themselves exists to this day. So the only thing we know about the Sadducees are written down by people that disagreed vehemently with the Sadducees. So a lot of the Pharisees writing about the Sadducees is known, and the Pharisees didn't think the Sadducees were good for anything. So in the New Testament, we only run across them a handful of times, and this is the one. And this is the one thing that the Bible actually says the Sadducees believed. They did not believe in the resurrection of the dead, whereas the Pharisees did. Part of that is because the Sadducees did not believe that any books of the Old Testament were valid except for the laws of Moses. So from Joshua all the way to Malachi, they said this is not actually inspired scripture, not part of the Bible. But since the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection, they were sad, you see. So that's how you remember that.
So good.
So they asked Jesus the question that apparently the Pharisees could never answer satisfactorily, and they asked, what about a man who was married to a woman, or a woman who is married to a man? The man dies, so she gets married to his brother. He dies, she marries the 3rd brother, all the way on down to the 7th brother. Doesn't have any children by any of them. So at the resurrection, whose wife will she be, since she was married to all 7 of them? Because they're thinking in earthly terms, and that obviously when we get resurrected, we need to have a wife. Well, what are these guys going to do? They had 7, or she had 7 husbands. And that just seems like an awful mess. So Jesus just simply tells them, you don't know what you're talking about, because at the resurrection will not be like mankind is today, will be like the angels in heaven, who are neither married nor given in marriage. And he answers them in that fashion. But then he goes on and explains further. He says, haven't you read, and he quotes from Genesis or Exodus, where God introduces himself to Moses as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And he says God is the God of the living, not of the dead. So he answered them from a piece of the Old Testament that they thought was authoritative, Whereas the Pharisees would always reference Daniel, because Daniel talks about the resurrection, but the Sadducees are like, we don't even believe in that. Who cares about what Daniel says? He's just smoking. So, Jesus illustrated from the Pentateuch that they believed in that there's going to be a resurrection. So then the Sadducees were put in their place, and a lawyer, and in some circumstances he's associated with the Pharisees and is trying to lay another trap. In other contexts, he is seeing how Jesus is answering so well, so he decides to throw his own question out there just to see what Jesus would say. And it was not necessarily baiting him, but he just simply asked, what is the greatest commandment? Which Jesus says is love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul.
Pretty simple question.
It was actually a pretty simple question. That has been something that had been discussed earlier in the Old Testament, I believe. But that was a point of discussion regularly in the culture. So, and for kicks, he threw the second greatest commandment in there too, and said that the whole law and prophets were hanging on those two commands.
Probably for our benefit. That we have a second one.
Yep. So then Jesus decides he's going to ask a question and put them all to shame. And so he asks them whose son is the Christ. And they say David's son, because that's what everybody knew. Messiah was supposed to be a son of David. So then Jesus, after he's got them hooked, says, so how is it that David says, the Lord said to my Lord, I will put everyone at your feet, or something like that. And so Jesus says, so David is referring to the Messiah as his Lord, even though he's supposed to be his son. And no one could answer that question. So no one asked him any more questions. Very fitting.
It is under fifty.
Yes.
Why did it go off? That's weird.
So then Jesus had the floor, and he spoke 7 woes to the scribes and the Pharisees, and they did not rebut or refute Jesus in any of these. Has anybody ever given a woe?
Maybe.
Woe to you?
Yes.
What does it mean?
People describe their roles.
Well, woe means like sadness. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you're saying like woe to something. I don't know. I use it as an insult sometimes. Don't know if it's necessarily meant supposed to be that way, but
Yes, it's kind of like saying distress and anguish to you
yeah.
because of such and such.
Yeah.
Yes, and so Jesus really lays out his beef with the Pharisees. It's interesting, though, the things that he does commend them on, and the things that he does say they do well. They're really sharp on tithing. I have never tithed off of my spices that I've grown in my gardens, but Jesus commended them for tithing off of their dill, mint, and cumin, which are low-producing spices, but they tithed off of it. Jesus said you should have kept doing that, but you should have remembered mercy and grace.
When you think about it, the priests have to live off their tithes. And if they weren't tithing their dill, mint, cumin, that's some bland
Bland food that they get to
So
eat.
someone had
Exactly.
to be tithing that, so I
And
mean,
Mexican food, if you didn't have the cumin, Mexican food would be pretty boring today.
Uh-huh.
exactly.
That's like one of the oregano or like the chief flavors of
Yes.
Mexican
So
food.
someone
I
had
know.
to be tithing that, and they just labeled them the Pharisees.
I know. Yeah, the priest did not have access to good Mexican food without cumin coming in the tithe. So.
Exactly. And chilies.
All right, so Tuesday continues with Jesus leaving the temple, and one or a few of the disciples remark on the splendor of the temple and its majesty and all the glory, and they just like the architecture. And Jesus just throws out there, yep, every single one of these stones is going to be torn down stone from stone. And no one says anything about this because they're still in Jerusalem. And they silently, with no conversation that is recorded, walk out of Jerusalem all the way across the valley up into the Mount of Olives. And it's not till they get to the top of the Mount of Olives, presumably to the Garden of Gethsemane where they're staying sometimes, that then the disciples ask Jesus, what were you saying about the temple being ripped down? Because that is a loaded prediction.
Hey, and good discernment on their part. Don't talk about that in Jerusalem. That's how you create a riot and mass consternation. You talk about
Yes.
that on the Mount of Olives.
So, Jesus then proceeds to give them the signs of the end of the age, which I like to mention, is the end of the age, not the end of the world.
Well, that is a key distinction.
Yes.
Wait. So is that then the end of the age before the 1,000 years of reigning with Christ? Then is that
Right, because that's another age.
right. That's another
With
age.
the earth.
So presumably, then the end of the age is before that time, and so that's kind of the transition.
That's the
thing now?
transition point into
Yeah.
the seventh age. Yes.
Seven.
So what we usually think, yes. So James Ussher broke up the history of the world into 6 ages with the coming 7th age, and it's just simply a way of dividing things up. There's nothing in the scriptures that necessarily accords to it, but it is an interesting way of doing it. So the first age was the pre-flood world. The second age was from the ark landing until Abram is called, and that's going to be when the Tower of Babel takes place. Then you have the age of the patriarchs, which goes from Abraham's call till Moses gets called. And then you have, let's see, that was 3 ages. So the 4th age is Moses to the building of the temple. And the 5th age is from the temple to Jesus being crucified.
That's a big chunk of stuff going on.
Yep, 1,000 years there, plus a little bit. And then after Jesus ascends into heaven, the 6th age begins. And so Jesus, as he's talking about this, is actually at the cusp of a turning point of an age. And this is one that's pretty easy to see from the scriptures, because you have, before the crucifixion, a completely different covenant with the Jews and with mankind in general. And post-Jesus resurrection, you have something very new, very different. And so there's an easy age division right there. All the other ones, James Ussher just kind of wove in.
I mean,
It's
That's
fun,
like
organizational
kind of-
system.
It's kind of logical in a
Yeah.
sense, but yeah.
And then there's also the fun thing that the 1,000 years with Jesus reigning on earth is the 7th age. And we like having things in sevens because that's a week, right?
Yes.
And that would be the Sabbath.
The
So,
perfect number.
yes, the perfect number, and it's
Works
a rest.
too well.
Works insanely well.
Too well.
They're not 1,000-year ages, though, because several of those are quite short, and the first one is 656 years too long. Moving on, that was a digression, all for bonus. So Jesus talks about the end of the age and gives all kinds of signs, and he references back to Daniel a few times, which is really helpful, because then you can understand that some of the things Daniel said have not actually fully been fulfilled, but the day before that, a lot of Jesus' disciples probably would have said, yes, and this dream of Daniel's was fulfilled. And then Jesus talks about how it hasn't been fulfilled.
They probably
So-
went to bed that night scratching their heads.
Yes, probably. Then Jesus tells 3 more parables: the parable of the 10 virgins, the parable of the talents, and the parable of the sheep and the goats. And these are all end of the age parables. They all reference the judgment coming in one way or another. Let's see. And then the long, long Tuesday finally comes to an end. So most of Crucifixion week that's recorded landed on Tuesday. Wednesday is a short, hardly anything is recorded that happens day. This is where we get another one of those discrepancies, though, in that Jesus is anointed in Bethany, again, and the John account has that happening the Saturday before Crucifixion week, but the other Gospels all have it happening on Wednesday-ish. And it's a dinner at Simon the leper's house. Both of these times he's getting anointed by a woman. It's named, or she is named Mary in the John account, but she's not named in the other ones. And the dinner happens in Bethany, although in the John account it seems to be at the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, although it's not explicitly stated that it's their house. Whereas in the other gospel accounts it's Simon the leper's house. And I don't know why they're having dinner in a leper's house, honestly, because this guy was leprous and he shouldn't be within 10 steps of any other person. So I don't know how that
Breaking
works.
protocol.
And Jesus doesn't heal the guy, which is another interesting thing. Unless he was Simon who was the leper, possibly. I don't know.
That might have just been like his moniker or whatever, because it seems like Simon was a very common name, so you gotta distinguish these guys. And you've been calling him Simon the Leper for 35 years. That's Simon the Leper.
Alright, so that's Micaiah's explanation of Simon the leper and why they're having dinner in his house. Very good. Anyway, disciples scold her for it. It's not specified that it's Judas, but they all are like, oh my gosh, it was crazy expensive. You could have sold that for tons of money, and the money could have been given to the poor. Very similar theme to the other John account version. But interestingly enough, the other gospel accounts then have it as after this event, and it's clearly on this Wednesday, that Judas Iscariot agrees to betray Jesus, and he's given 30 pieces of silver to do it.
What did the Pharisees really gain from knowing which one was Jesus? Jesus always said who he was.
They needed to get him when he wasn't surrounded by a crowd. And so they needed to know where he was sleeping at night. Where can we get him under the cover of darkness? They needed an insider who knew his whereabouts. And then when you got a crowd of soldiers who don't know Jesus from Adam, you have to have them get identified in torchlight. Which of these guys here, because there's 15 or more jokers around, like which one of these is actually the
And they
one
all
we're
sound
trying to get?
strange.
They all sound strange. They all sound like Galileans. Yep. Hicks from the Northland.
How much was 30 pieces of silver?
I'm not sure. That might be a month's wages. If it's a denarius. I'm not sure if the pieces of silver were denarius or some other coin. It might have been shekels, in which case I don't know the shekel to denarius conversion rate. You could research that though. I find it ironic that it's April Fool's Day today that Judas Iscariot betrays Jesus, or agrees to do so.
Well, he certainly was.
It was not known as April Fool's Day back then, but it is now.
He certainly was a fool.
Yep. So then we shift into Thursday, 2nd of April. Peter and John are the two disciples that get sent into Jerusalem to prepare the Passover meal, and that takes the whole day, but they find the upper room where they're going to do this, and they get it all ready and make all the arrangements, and Jesus comes into the city in the evening, and they sit down for the Last Supper after sunset. And this is an important thing to note here, actually, because they're starting to celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and this is where a modern day and a Jewish day end up messing with all kinds of things, because after sunset, they're in the next day in their head. And so this is when Passover has already begun, because the day starts in the evening, it doesn't start in the morning. So we still call it Thursday, but they already feel like it's the next day, even though they haven't gone to bed. Kind of interesting how that works out. So they're celebrating the Passover with Jesus, who is the Passover lamb to come, who's about to get offered up as the ultimate Passover sacrifice on Passover itself.
Man, New Year's Day would be the weirdest thing for them. Because for them, the day switches at like 9 o'clock or whatever. But that's not how it works.
Everybody's awake to party. It'd be a much better day. Even the kids can stay up that late.
People stay up to party.
Not the 4-year-olds. Not as many 4-year-olds. All right, so at the Last Supper, he institutes the Lord's Supper. And so communion has a lot of carryover from Passover. And it's also at this time that Satan enters Judas. Judas leaves the Passover to betray Jesus. The disciples have no idea what's going on. They think he's just getting something else for dinner or giving some money to the poor. As fitting for the disciples, they have an argument over who is the greatest. And then when Jesus starts talking about how he's going to be arrested, Peter says that he will go to the death with him, and Jesus says, really? This very evening you're going to deny me 3 times. And Peter swears up and down he won't do that. So then, the John account of this evening is extremely long, because, yeah, wow, now that I think about it, this one day in John's account starts in John chapter 13 and goes through at least chapter 19.
Whoa.
So it's a lot of chapters devoted to this one day. You would think it's kind of important, Jesus dying. Pretty. So one of the things that comes across only in the John account is that Jesus is promising to send the Holy Spirit. And this is after Judas is out of their midst. And shortly after that, they leave the upper room and they start walking to Gethsemane. And John records many other conversations that they have on this walk that are not recorded in any of the other Gospels. And this is where Jesus talks about himself being the true vine, and then he warns them that the world is going to hate them, and then he describes what the ministry of the Holy Spirit is actually going to be. And then in John chapter 17, Jesus prays for them. This is the famous being in the world but not of the world passage that comes across. And then they get to Gethsemane, and John's account, when they get to Gethsemane, he has Jesus getting arrested immediately, but in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're there for an hour or so, and Jesus is praying while the disciples are sleeping. And this is another time that Jesus took Peter, James, and John in just a little bit further, and had the three of them set apart from the other 9.
What was up with James? Because he gets killed off right away. Does he do anything special?
Yeah, he dies first.
Wait.
So, yeah, you're giving stuff away from the book of Acts. But James was the first of the 12 to be executed. His brother John was the last of the 12 to die. First and the last. Yep, and they wanted to sit at his left hand and his right hand.
Well, that was those two.
That was those two,
Oh.
yes. Let's see. So we're somewhere in the night. We're going to say that this is technically still Thursday, but for all we know is after the second watch of the night, and we're past midnight when he gets betrayed. But Judas arrives, betrays Jesus. Peter draws a sword, cuts off the ear of Malchus. Jesus sticks the ear, sticks it back on Malchus. Then he gets arrested. But once again, like you mentioned, why is it that they need Judas? So Judas has to identify Jesus to the guys who are actually coming to arrest him. Because even though it may seem like Jesus has been out in public and everybody should know who he is, there are easily tens of thousands of foreigners in Jerusalem for the feast, and maybe even a few 100,000 people in the neighborhood. And so having a few soldiers sent out to figure out who to arrest, they need someone who can get a positive ID. They don't have the wanted posters like we have today. So that was Judas's role. And that's why he gives them the sign, the one that I kiss is the one you want to arrest, and everybody else runs off. And that's the interesting thing about John's account, because John wanted to make sure that everybody knew he didn't run away. Because the other accounts have him running away.
They probably just assumed you
Yep, Peter and John don't flee. They end up taking Jesus to the house of Caiaphas. Peter is following at a distance. We don't know what distance John was following with, but John actually knows Caiaphas, and so he gets into the courtyard, and then he's the one that makes arrangements to get Peter into the courtyard so that they could be a little closer to figure out what's going on with Jesus while he's getting tried. So then we have this fun gospel two-part. You've got one plot line going on in the trial, another plot line going on out in the courtyard, because Jesus is getting tried by the Sanhedrin, and they're bringing witnesses, and the witnesses don't agree with each other. And then they ask Jesus, and they ask, "Are you the Messiah?" And Jesus says, "I am he." And they're like, "What more do we need? Crucify him." It's kind of funny. You can answer a question accurately and correctly and still be called guilty. But anyway, out in the courtyard, Peter is trying to not get too closely associated with Jesus, and so he denies Jesus 3 times. Don't know what John is doing, but Peter runs off after this happens. And John actually stuck with Jesus and saw him get crucified. He was the only one of the 12 recorded to see the crucifixion. So then we're going to say it's April 3rd, although some of this has happened in the night after midnight. But getting through the crucifixion, these are all familiar events. Jesus gets taken to Pilate early in the morning after the sun rises. Pilate tries to dodge, so he sends him to Herod. Herod doesn't get Jesus to perform any signs, so he gets bored and sends him back to Pilate. Somehow this causes Pilate and Herod to become friends. I don't know why, but that's what it says. Pilate ends up releasing Barabbas, the murderer and the insurrectionist, and they condemn Jesus. Jesus gets crucified with 2 thieves. Lots of other details happen in the midst of this. Judas, meanwhile, returns the silver to the chief priests. In that account, in the tax account, he buys a field with the silver. In any case, that silver was used to buy a field that was later named the Field of Blood. Why it was named the Field of Blood has two stories. How Judas dies has two stories. Whether Judas bought the field or the priest bought the field with the same coins, it's two stories, but
Coins bought field.
yes, coins bought field, Judas is dead by the end of the day. Back at the crucifixion, Jesus dies, darkness covers the land. Temple curtain gets torn in two, and Jesus' body is pulled off the cross by Joseph of Arimathea, who was another secret disciple of Jesus, kind of like Nicodemus. He was in the Sanhedrin, had not consented to the decision to put Jesus to death. He was a no vote, but he was in the minority. He had an unused tomb that had been cut into stone that was quite nearby, and so they put Jesus in there just before sundown. As the day ended, the Sabbath began, and they were not supposed to be touching dead bodies or doing any work. Well, they'd been touching a dead body. They weren't supposed to do any work. They were unclean now.
Seems a little creepy to have just a random unused tomb available.
Probably for himself.
It was probably for himself, yeah. And my mother has a gravestone that has her name on it. It doesn't have her day of death because she's not dead yet, but
But does she have a hole dug yet?
no, she doesn't have
Does
the
that-
hole dug yet. Yeah, so if you ever cut a hole into a cave into stone, I imagine that would take a little bit of time. So
Well, it takes a little bit of time, but then also like you have to own the thing first, and so there's probably a little bit of prestige associated with it. And they use family tombs, so he was likely planning for that to be used by him and probably his son and his grandson and his great grandson. So he wanted to get the thing made so that way it was around, so that way they could just start filling it up with his lineage.
yep, that could be. They also had to deal with bodies in short order. They didn't have refrigeration options to delay funerals. So you had to have your tomb ready to go. Otherwise they did something else with you. Alright. So, Jesus is dead. There is a theory out there that he was only swooned, meaning that he was not all dead, he was only mostly dead, and that somebody was stuck in the tomb with him and pumped his body full of herbs and spices, and that brought him back to full consciousness. And this is the crazy, unbelieving version of how Jesus was resurrected. It's called swoon theory. Doesn't have anything in the Gospels that would point in that direction, because there's nothing that says anybody was buried with him. In fact,
Well, also, like when the soldier stabbed him, like blood and water came out, which means he's dead.
yes,
Like, that's a clear sign somebody's dead.
yes. Do you know why it's a clear sign somebody's dead?
Because
water is-
Say that again?
Because the water and the blood separate when you die.
Yes. And that is actually, it's an interesting thing. I've always wondered about this. In the art, they always have Jesus getting pierced in this side. It says water and blood gushed out. But I'm pretty sure that the water and blood separating was the water around the sac of his heart. And so that would have him getting speared through on this side. But anyhow, yeah, Roman soldiers pretty bit sharp on telling if people are alive or dead. They were responsible to make sure that he was dead. They kill off the thieves by breaking their legs so they can no longer breathe. They suffocate and get their crucifixion over with in short order. Jesus already being dead, and just to make sure they run him through with a spear. Yes, he should be very dead. There's no question about that. But people have their theories because they got to come up with some way to explain a resurrection. They've been doing that ever since he resurrected, actually. The first theory is the disciples stole the body, obviously. So, Saturday, April 4th, the women rested in obedience with the command. They don't go to the grave to embalm him and finish up the burial preparations. And that ends Crucifixion week. So there's no shortage of things that we glossed over and skimmed over. Does anybody have any questions about anything that came up or did not come up. Major signs from Crucifixion week: healing blind and lame people in the temple, cursing the fig tree. And the cursing of the fig tree is one of those interesting miracles where it's Jesus interacting miraculously with the created forces of nature. It's kind of like the water in the or the waves in the wind obeying his command, where nature itself is listening to him, not just a person being healed or raised back from the dead. Water into wine is another one. The miraculous catch of fish is another one.
Coin in the fish's mouth.
Coin in the fish's mouth. Loaves and fishes is, yeah, right in there. So, the words of wisdom that he gives and the prophecies of the ends of the age, predicting Peter's denial and even synchronizing it with when the rooster crows. Which, I can only imagine what that must have been like. There was a time I was in Costa Rica on a missions trip, and we were in rural Costa Rica, and a whole bunch of us were just sleeping in a church sanctuary, not too much smaller than this one actually, because we were working with the church down there, and so it was kind of more of an open air church building though, in that they just had to protect it from rain. Cold weather was not an issue, so no, there were just windows, but there was no glass in the windows because you just wanted to let light in, but you didn't have to keep bugs or anything out. So anyway, lots of fun things, snakes and monstrosity. No, not toads there. It was cockroaches. Saw cockroaches that were bigger than anything I've ever seen anywhere. But the roosters there, we wanted to wring their necks by the end of that week because they started at 3 in the morning. In ungodly hours of the night, and they would be like just 2 or 3 feet away from you. You're sleeping there, and all of a sudden they would crow. It's just like, why do you have to crow? There is nothing in the sunrise.
Fried chicken.
Yes. They weren't our roosters or chickens, but they were. We were just about ready to purchase the carcass of them. So. All right, healing Malchus's ear is the last major sign that I can think of from Crucifixion week. Any final thoughts, questions? All right. It's been a blitz. We have one more week. We'll have Jesus raised from the dead and go through all of his post-resurrection appearances and then his ascension into heaven. A little bit of extra time, and then we'll be post-gospel.